Morning, everybody. I'm super excited to welcome Nelson Wang. Nelson, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Sugata. Appreciate it. Really excited to be here.
I've been following you, on LinkedIn for a while. You have a lot of great things to share, and I know we've been kind of going back and forth. But before we get started, I'd love to have you take a minute or two and introduce yourself.
Awesome. So great to meet everyone. My name's Nelson, and I am the founder of Partner Principles. And basically, what I do is share back a lot of lessons and learnings I've had in partnerships over the last 20 years of being an operator within partnerships at fast growth companies as well as large public companies as well. And what I focus on now is making sure partner leaders have those set of lessons, principles, and frameworks to make them successful. And I also consult companies, typically at the CXO level, to be able to help them build out their partner programs and strategy effectively so that they move the needle on the business outcomes they care about, like revenue, pipeline, net retention, gross retention, logo acquisition, customer success and satisfaction, and more. So that's the quick intro.
Awesome. Why did you decide to start your consulting business?
So I'm very passionate about this, which is that for many partnership leaders and individuals, it's very hard for them oftentimes to get the support and the enablement that they need to be truly successful in the role. And so I really wanted to give back to the community. That's really important to me because I remember working so many late nights and weekends where I didn't have someone to bounce ideas off of, or I wasn't able to find the answer online. And ultimately, a big part of this, why it was so hard, was because I wasn't taught first principles thinking and frameworks on how to build partnerships successfully. Most of the learnings that I had were around tactics and playbooks. And a big light bulb moment for me was when I got the right mentors along the way who were very kind, and they gave me their time and they taught me about first principles thinkings and frameworks. And that's where everything shifted in the quality of my work, in the outcomes that I was able to drive in the positions that I had. And so what I'm really passionate about is taking those lessons and sharing it back out to the world so that people don't have to stress as much, don't have to work as many long hours, and ultimately they get to the answer and success faster and better, and they can get that time back with their families, or not be up late at night. And so for me, that is my core intrinsic motivation in ensuring that people are successful at the end of the day.
That's great. So, why did you start your consulting business?
Something I'm really passionate about is folks need a lot of help. I've seen that again and again in talking to many partner leaders and companies and founders. And what they need help on is getting clarity on the partner strategy, where to focus their energy and time, what they should resource. And ultimately, driving a lot of that is this understanding around first principles thinking and frameworks. And I was very lucky because in my career, I had a lot of mentors along the way that taught me that. And that was like the big light bulb moment for me, where I realized, it's one thing to learn tactics and playbooks, but if you're able to learn principles that really can guide your strategic decision making and work, you get much better answers. And what I want to do is to share those lessons back with the partnerships community, with founders, with C-suite level folks, so that they don't have to spend those long hours at night or on the weekend trying to figure out the answer and doing a lot of research, but instead have these guiding principles to make them successful in a much faster and efficient way. And so I really want to be able to share these lessons from the past 20 years of operating in partnerships back to the community within tech so that ultimately people can spend more time with their family, they can get to success faster, and ultimately provide better customer outcomes through partners.
That's awesome. So I want to go back to those couple of words that you use, first principles, because I follow you online, so I kind of know what you mean by that. But for our audience, I think it will be great for you to explain, what do you mean by first principles?
What I mean is, instead of bringing a playbook, for example, that might have worked from one company to the new company that you're joining, which is commonly seen out there in the world, instead operate from a set of principles where you can apply it to any company you join, regardless of what the ICP looks like or the ideal partner profile, et cetera. So a really good example that I often share and play back with people is this principle of being customer-centric as an example. And oftentimes when I consult companies and partner leaders, they will start talking immediately about what they're doing with partners, the types of partners, and what they're struggling with that regard. Well, one of the things I try to anchor them back on is this principle of customer centricity. And so, for example, before we even get to partner types and trying to build more partner pipeline and revenue, one of the first questions I will ask them is, who is your ICP? What is the customer journey that they're going on? What is their customer pain that you're solving for? And what are the business implications for not solving that pain? Because that is so important to understand, to then be able to say, these are the right partner types and the strategy we should put in place with partners to go solve for those specific customer problems that have high business implications. And when we're customer centric, it gives you a very clear view on where to go focus, what you should resource and spend energy on, and ultimately gets you to a much better answer versus trying to test a bunch of partner types right off the bat and being spread too thin, as an example. So that's a core example I always go back to regarding principles. Another one that I often talk about is this idea of one team, where so many partnerships teams operate in silos but are not working cross-functionally with many other teams to augment and amplify what they do. One quick example of this is marketing often has like a set of initiatives they work on to go drive demand. How are partnerships being integrated into their core workflows around marketing to amplify that? For example, if you did a webinar, instead of just inviting 100 people on your own, a partner might double that with their customer base as well. And suddenly, because you work together as one team, as a core principle, the impact to the business is doubled, right? Because of that process, as an example. So just sharing a few core principles as an example here, but these are so critical because you can apply this at any company that you go to get better success at the end of the day.
You have an amazing background at Cisco, VMware, multiple companies, and now you're working with, some major companies. I want to go back a little bit, sort of the history of ecosystem, which used to be predominantly called a channel, 20 years ago. What do you think fundamentally has changed over the last couple of decades when it comes to go to market, whether what do you call it, ecosystem today, and what we used to call channel yesterday?
Well, I started at Cisco and VMware, and this was back 20 years ago, first at Cisco. And one of the things that was different in the hardware software world back then was you basically could make this decision around swim lanes and say, we want to route all of our business through, for example, resellers to be able to scale our reach with our customers. And so you saw this decision often made by companies like a Cisco, Microsoft, VMware, et cetera, where they were able to quickly scale the market by going through, for example, this resell motion. And you can still see elements of that today with certain companies that are newer, but it is harder to do this swim lane because a lot of these companies have a direct product-led growth motion with customers. And so by nature, because so much of their business starts off direct, it is significantly harder to make that decision to go full swim lanes with like a resell motion, as an example. So what have we seen in that transformation? The types of swim lanes are more nuanced now. As an example, you might see swim lanes with these leading B2B SaaS or AI companies broken down by region. So for example, in APAC, it may be tremendously different and much more partner-led than the Americas, where a lot more business there might be direct. That's one swim lane, regions. Another one might be by segment. So if the company is really focused on having for example, the services team focus up market, you might carve out swim lanes for all other services to be done by partners down market and say mid-market and commercial, as an example. So segmentation swim lanes can also be another one. Another one could be by capabilities. So by saying, for example, we do not deliver XYZ capabilities, and so there's a gap on the customer journey with other capabilities required. And so a swim lane there might be based on this capability need in this decision tree. We then route it to the partners for each of those capabilities that needs to be deployed with the customer. And that's another distinct swim lane. One last one I'll mention is by vertical. And so what's also being seen is companies may not have domain expertise within a certain vertical and may say, we want partners to lead both, for example, the resell and the services motion within that vertical. And that's another type of swim lane that can be carved out. So what's interesting now with these companies is it's much more nuanced, and you see many different types of swim lanes being carved out based on what their customers need and mapping partners back to that.
So, am I hearing from you that thing when you say nuance, is there another way to read it? It's a lot more complex than it used to be.
100%. It's definitely more complex. It requires a lot of deep diving into really making sure you understand your ideal customer profiles and the personas and the economic buyers and the pain they're going through, and making sure you're mapping back partners to go solve for the challenges that they're running into. And so it's just much more nuanced now, where you could potentially have multiple swim lanes within a company, whereas before you might have only even carved out one swim lane at whole. And so that is a big difference now as you see this evolution of these companies in the B2B SaaS and AI native world today.
So, when you follow someone like Jay McBain, he talks about very large numbers, right? Hundreds of thousands, millions and zillions. And I'm going to ask this to Jay, and he says these enormous amount of investment that has been made by Cisco's and the VMwares and the Microsoft of the world has created very, very large ecosystem, right? And kind of using your word that you really need to know how to swim in those ecosystems, right? So we have also recently seen the rise of another word called orchestration. So is it fair to say, and I'd love to sort of get more color from you on this, is that, when you kind of threw a product out and you dimensional partnership based on volume, gold, silver, bronze, whatever, versus you're seeing more partner types because your lanes are different. How do you think this evolution has happened and where it's kind of going? These Is it going to get simpler as you go in the future because a lot of these parts of this ecosystem kind of die out, or is it going to get more fragmented? So talk to me a little bit about the evolution, where we are and where we're going from a partner types, partner roles wise.
A lot of the same core principles apply. It's just that the partners we might be seeing rise up might look a bit different in terms of their go to market and their services offerings, but there will be a lot of similarities in principle. So at the end of the day, whether it was 20 years ago or now, the outcome of what the partner needs to do is still the same, which is they need to make customers massively successful, and they need to tie to those business outcomes and make sure that they're getting them there. That stays the same. Some of the mechanics that are different are nowadays it requires a different skill set, even though a lot of the frameworks around those skill sets might be the same. So what do I mean by that? For example, back when I was at Cisco and VMware, a company might do the resell motion, which is very common. And then on top of that, also do services around the implementation, for example, the virtualization of those data centers, where they would go install the software platform, make sure the VMs were up and running correctly, and if there's any downtime, they have managed services to go support that. Today, the evolution is now a lot of these fast rising companies around the next generation of B2B SaaS and AI revolve around providing both potentially resell and referral, but also services on how to, for example, deploy AI effectively within an organization. So those skill sets are now different, right? And they have to be able to guide customers on a framework on how to identify possible AI use cases based on things like resourcing, feasibility, business impact, prioritization. And, those are the key things that they're now focused on to help people get to that business outcome today. So there are similarities that we see, definitely, but ultimately the skill sets to get them there are constantly evolving and, are changing over time over this, the last 2 decades dramatically. And people need to be able to adapt to that to be able to better serve the customer to get them to the outcome in terms of their AI journey today and with B2B SaaS as well.
So if we think, revenue as sort of an identifier, a couple of decades ago, let's say $100 million is kind of a product line, right? Roughly. And it has velocity. And then you roll up multiple lines, you get to a business unit. Then you roll up multiple business units, you have a company, right? A large enterprise level. So let's say at $100 million level, a couple of decades ago, what did the channel organization or partner organization look like? And today, if you're on an average, I know we're grossly generalizing, it would vary, but what do you see the key differences using your word skill sets? Like, When I'm as a CRO or CPO trying to design my organization, what elements are fundamentally different today?
Just so I understand the question, do you mean 100 million in aggregate revenue at the company level, or 100 million driven through the partner ecosystem?
100 million, let's say, flowing through a partner ecosystem for a product line, for a product category. Because each product category, chances are, may require different combinations of partner and partner base, right? So let's assume 100 flowing through.
Yeah, I would say it really depends on the company and also the ICP that they're serving and what you're trying to solve for. And so the makeup of the partner team needs to be oriented around what are you trying to go and solve for the customer that is the highest impact? And then how do you resource that accordingly downstream? Because really the team is just a reflection of how do we better serve the customer to get to the outcome. And so, as an example, at that $100 million stage, what we're thinking about is what are the core elements that make that customer successful? And we know this because we might look at the quantitative side, which is are they spending more with us, right? So, looking at net retention, is their AR growth more significant when they work with a certain partner type? Is the gross retention also improved? Is their adoption also, going up and to the right because of working with this specific partner type? Those are all things we have to look at from the quantitative perspective to help inform that. And then the second is the qualitative, which is directly interviewing that customer and hearing it from them in their taxonomy, in their words, so that we understand where partners are making the impact. And you want to combine those two, the quantitative and the qualitative, to really understand what the conclusion should be in terms of where we should go invest for that customer. That then helps inform downstream how do you then resource the team to go support that, and allows you to determine whether you need headcount for that services partner manager or that SI manager or that reseller motion, right? And so forth, or integrations partner manager as another example. And again, the key is always back to why are we putting in place this headcount in terms of making an impact to the customer versus just starting to plug people in, either ad hoc or reactive. What we really want to anchor back to is what are the core outcomes we're trying to drive with the customer, and then build out the team downstream from there.
So I want to go back to these two words, first principles, that you talked about. And one of the comment you made is that, you cannot just move from one organization to another and take your playbook. I completely understand from a composition of the solution sale or product sale or transaction sale that would determine what playbook you put in. But assume it's a similar type of product. If you dial back and focus on, let's say, strictly hardware side, right? How hardware was sold 20 years ago and how hardware is sold today. I have two-part question. One is, has it fundamentally changed? And second of all, are the metrics different? Because, the world I came from 20 years ago, you didn't look at a lot of channel metrics. You looked at sales out, you looked at coverage, you looked at, dollar per rep, and you kind of figured out where to put another rep, where to get another disty, essentially to get coverage, right? Maybe you did some math, but that's about it. So walk us through, and that organization reflected on the metrics you put in and what you try to achieve, right? So walk us through that hardware journey, and then we'll come to the software. Has it evolved or is it roughly the same? What has changed from a first principle wise?
That's a great question. I would say, in my experience, what I've seen is a lot of the core principles still hold true. And as an example, you were talking about this earlier around the assessing for the potential market expansion. One of the things that commonly I would see done is sizing the market first and understanding, do we think there's enough addressable market that warrants the investment? And also the other key is, where do we prioritize that market versus other potential markets? And so that exercise doesn't really change whether it's hardware or software in terms of the partnership motion, because you're generally just trying to figure out first, what is the TAM and the potential prioritization of that specific area that we might make an investment in. And I still see that play out, whether that's 20 years ago, or I actually just recently did that last week in a consulting engagement. And so that still comes into play for sure. The other piece of it that I have seen still be the same is making sure that you have a good financial model to determine when to make these investments. And again, what the payback period might look like, specific with that set of resourcing when you go with the partnerships team built out and investing in the partners within that specific industry or segment or region. And that also has been consistent. The nuance there is the tweaks to the financial model can change as you go from company to company, but ultimately a lot of the same frameworks still apply at the end of the day. So I would say actually in principle, not many huge changes that I've seen over the 20 years in terms of the approach on it. But I would say the tweaks are typically going from company to company based on their business model and also the types of customers they work with that you'll see some nuance and variation in.
I'll come back to software, but I want to stay on hardware a little bit because I don't get a chance to talk to a lot of hardware people. So when you think about, distribution played a major role because they played a bank and a warehouse. They took your, merchandises back, refurbished at some case, shipped it back out. They played a major role. Of course, they trained, they recruited, all of the above. But with the rise of 3PL, right? Like, especially if you look at the main broadliner like FedEx or DHL or UPS, they do a lot of drop ship. Even hardware companies today, they bypass distribution because they have a lot more control if they're doing direct complemented with partner co-sell kind of motion, right? Do you see that part of the chain, so like the delivery chain, which is distribution from a hardware side, has been impacted first by 3PL and second by maybe financing because there are other banks are now involved that can finance what FedEx is shipping versus what Ingram or Tech Data used to do?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, there's a lot of advantages to distribution. And I saw that firsthand. So I wanted to highlight that. One is certainly on delivery times because just because it'll be in region, being able to better serve the customer and getting to the outcome faster by ensuring that they get the hardware potentially faster than the drop shipping approach, as an example. And so I've seen that firsthand. The other aspect that you mentioned is on the financing or the financial aspects of it as well. And so being able to tap into that and to scale that and not have to manage that operationally is also a huge advantage of often going through like a distributor as well. And then the third aspect that distributors are very good at and can help with is the operational aspects of even just managing the workflows of actually processing that order, which may not sound that like a heavy lift, but I've lived and breathed it myself. And so having to do things like go through a bidding process and signing up multiple resellers, especially within different regions, and managing 3 different agreements as you go through that, there's a lot of pain in that. And so distribution can help streamline that, especially if you appoint them the ability to do a lot of that workflow. And so that can save you a tremendous amount of manual workflows, lift, and chasing of tasks that need to be done in order to get a deal done, as an example. So there are a lot of benefits in doing that and trade-offs that you'll want to consider if you're looking at dropship versus through a distributor. But I found there's a lot of key benefits that definitely tie to distributors in the past at hardware companies that I've worked at.
So when you look at that part of the chain, right? Like 20 years ago, for sure 30 years ago, distribution was a hot business. You made a lot of margin. I mean, not to the order you would make in software, but you made this margin, at least 10 points. And but it made up of several things: funded heads, buyback programs, financing program, marketing campaigns, MDF allocations, et cetera, right? And as those started to shrink because of whatever reason, they try to go acquire and scale up and build size. And if you look at the broadliners today, they're 40, 50, 60 billion dollar. They're barely throwing in any net income. I mean, sometimes even negative. Do you have any perspective, like what shifted that dynamics? Like, why are they not being able to make money? Valuation is almost 10 cents on the dollar right now on their revenue, right? So what happened there to part of that distribution? Is it because they lost the software sales to marketplaces? Is it because, like, what's ailing distribution financially?
Yeah, I think on the software side, we've seen it with the PLG motion and also with marketplaces where a lot of the buying behavior has shifted to direct with that SaaS or AI platform, or they're consolidating purchases under the marketplace for, credit burn downs or financial incentives or for ease of procurement. And so I think that has definitely probably made an impact in terms of basically shifting the volume of revenue to those specific channels. And what I would say though is interesting is you still have a lot of these partners that are doing the services and resell and referral motion with these AI and B2B SaaS companies. And there is a possibility it could go through distribution, although I haven't always seen it at the same level as I did back in the, like 20 years ago. And I think partly for that, one is they tend to have more of a direct relationship, especially if they're one of the top, call it 20, 30% directly with the platform company itself. So we're seeing more of that. And then the other aspect is it tends to lean more towards distribution when it's, for example, industries or verticals that were already primarily through distribution. A good example is the public sector. Another one is also by the domain or the basically the area of expertise or specialty, right? So as an example, you tend to see more cybersecurity companies go heavy on partners, and by nature, going through distribution to increase their reach within that partner ecosystem could make more sense for them to engage with distribution to go get that to scale quickly. So you can sometimes see that play out as well. So those are some of the nuances of it that I see, and hopefully that's helpful.
And is it because you're saying at the point of distribution, you're putting solution bundles together from a end customer perspective? That's why distribution plays a role, or what role are they playing today that they may be struggling, sort of broadline distribution?
You're saying the role of the distributors.
Specialty ones that you're referring to, yeah.
Yeah, so I would say the role that they're playing is typically the reach into new ecosystem partners that the platform vendor may not already be engaged with. And so they're then tapping into the distributor to extend reach, typically by specialty or by region. And again, these are through their existing relationships. So that helps to scale that process. The other big one is in terms of consolidation of operations and ease of procurement, especially within certain industries, like I mentioned with government, public sector. And so they can streamline a lot of that process and make it easier so that, again, the vendor platform is not having to deal with many of those individual partners themselves, whether it's signing agreements or doing the bidding process and so forth.
So from an organization side, Nelson, when you think about how sort of channel chiefs used to design their organization, which is very, very fulfillment driven, versus what I'm kind of hearing you, they're dealing with a lot more opportunities, a lot more ways to go to market, but it's also a very complex thing that they need to sort of orchestrate, right? So what are you seeing skill shifts wise? I'll come back to the direct side, give you sort of a context. Like, if I were a CRO, or at that time maybe VP of sales, enterprise selling 100K deal, I need a field person, I need an inside salesperson, I need a bunch of people on the dial, LDR or SDR, whatever I want to call them, right? And that was my structure. Today, as a CRO, I have to have a heavy component of digital, right? I need to know buyer's intent, buyer's journey. What you used to call nurturing is very different today. So skill sets of my organization composition is very, very different, right? And it happened 5, 6, 7 within 7 years. Have you seen similar shift on the partner side of the business, or is it where is it?
100%. Yes. But I would say for a lot of companies, it's still early in that process for them. And what I mean by this is one of the most hotly discussed things over the last 20 years is this idea around what is partner influence versus sourced, as an example, right? And to an extent, that does matter because if they brought something net new accretive to the company, we all love that. That's great. And we want more source business. And you try to track that to the best of your ability based on the definitions you put in place that everyone aligns and agrees on. But what you also have to keep in mind is the reality is most customers have touch points with your company or your partners in many different facets, whether it's through sales or CS or marketing or the partner. There might be 20 different touch points before they actually purchase. And so the reality is attribution is a combination of art and science in the sense that you gather as much data as you can to help inform. And the reality is most cases it's going to be a multi-touch attribution, and you're going to weight it the best you can based on your formula that everyone hopefully aligns on. And the tough thing is, like, even if you have all that data, you don't perfectly know the answer because, even if you ask the customer and they say, this is the reason we bought, it actually may not be, right? Like, what if they were actually influenced by 3 other touch points? So that's why I say it's a combination of art and science. What I'm getting at, and I'll promise this will tie back to your question, is at the end of the day, right, what we have to think about is this entire life cycle of the customer, beginning to end, to get to the outcome. And then even after that, there's optimization, right? Because they're going to get to the outcome and they want to continually improve. We have to continually be thinking about that customer journey, right? And that life cycle and how different parts of the organization will help them to get to success over time. And more people are starting to think of this way where it's not just, focus on top of funnel with partners, which is very commonly seen in organizations, but more so when you think about the customer journey from awareness to consideration to purchase to retention to advocacy and so forth. What are all those things we need to be thinking about where a partner can help them in that journey to get to success? That is really how people are starting to think about it. I'm seeing more people embrace this mindset. And so it requires a lot more thoughtfulness and nuance about how partners can help out. And this is a good, healthy thing. And you're seeing this start to show up in programs. I believe Jay actually just recently wrote about this on LinkedIn, where you're seeing this evolution of partner programs that are not just focused on things like a source revenue number, but actually looking at other parts of the customer journey and the outcomes tied to that. And then they're measuring the partner back on those. One quick example is CSAT, right? So instead of just measuring something like partner source revenue, there might be a component on CSAT on the implementations that they do with the customer, as an example. And another one might be gross retention. So if they have 10 customers they work with today, both on the licensing and on the services side, they might have to retain 95% of those in gross retention. That might be another outcome you're measuring in a program, as an example. So hopefully that's helpful.
No, this is brilliant. So I want to double click on this on maybe a couple of dimensions. One is through swim lanes, and second through metrics. So when you think about, like, as we said a couple of decades ago, basic channel metrics were coverage, run rate, sales out rate, RMAs, etc. What I'm hearing from you today, now we have to think through these swim lanes tied to the customer segment you're trying to serve. Not only just that, over the life cycle you're trying to serve. So let's take 2 or 3 examples of partners, and let's take some metrics. So affiliate, for example, versus other extreme, maybe system integrator and MSPs, somewhere in between. And then you have a traditional reseller, right? And I've heard you say some metrics which are sort of bleeding in from the software world to the hardware world, like, LTV to CAC ratio, sort of the MRR coverage, or, your churn, and etc. If you take these sort of 3 or 4 partner types, and let's just simplify, say types define swim lanes, do you see companies have data and people infrastructure in place to really operate at a data-driven level where they know by those swim lanes where they should invest, why they should invest? And things are also in transition, right? System integration may be more capable with AI versus an affiliate may not, right? So what is the maturity at the organizational level you're seeing now, and what is the opportunity there for them to rise up?
I'm so happy you asked that question, because this is by far the biggest challenge with regards to this that I see over and over again, which is so many folks are operating on unstructured content or within typically Excel or Sheets. But the challenge that they have is, number one, the data integrity. Number two, the tying of that data and set of workflows that they built in their own silo into other core systems that are critical to the success of their customers and partners. And three, a lot of this work in process is incredibly manual and repetitive and low value, but you need to do a lot of that low value workflow set of components to get to the high value insights and workflows later. So you can't do without it, but the problem is it might take you half a day to even do all of that to get to where you need to go next. This is very, very common to see. And what's exciting is we have been very challenged with this in the past, but with AI, this is now a huge unlock where you can move on these components significantly faster, drive a lot of automation and insights that you normally would have either taken way too long to do or would feel overwhelmed with even taking on. But now with AI, it can transform the way that you're operating your business. And so we have an opportunity within partnerships to truly level up in this area to be significantly more successful. And so this requires this new mindset of really looking at all these workflows, doing that discovery and saying, what does it look like today? Let's map it all out. What are the repetitive manual motions of work that are low value that we can try to automate that get us to higher value? Or what are all those repetitive workflows that are high value that we should definitely be looking at automating and driving with AI? where we can, and how do we build out the systems and the data integrity to be able to go support that. And that is going to be really critical to leveling up partners within these organizations. But what's exciting is I'm starting to see this, right? And good examples of this are, and I'll be very specific, are things that we're used to doing a lot of manual workflows on. So one is, for example, with SIs or services partners, the building of the SOWs and getting the proposals out to customers. And Sugata, I've seen this firsthand sometimes take a week, a full week. We meet the customer, understand the needs, and we're now doing that workflow manually, and it takes a week. Whereas with AI, you can ingest that recording, automatically analyze the transcript. You can create an SOW based off of that gets you probably 80% of the way there. And then with AI, also create a proposal that is fully customized to that customer. Again, probably 80% of the way there. And you can now get that turnaround in probably 1 to 2 hours. And so the productivity of that partnerships company and also the individual partnerships manager or leader working with them is massively 10x. And what that leads to as an outcome is higher conversion rates, right? Bigger deal sizes, customer satisfaction in that sales process, as an example. And I'm picking a very narrow part of a process as an example, but I wanted to share this back because I've seen this happen experientially in real time, and the impacts are dramatic. And so what I get excited about is, for most companies, this is not there today, but they have an opportunity to embrace it and really transform the way they do partnerships across the board with this approach.
So at the beginning of our discussion, you talked about first principle, and there's one element that you talked about that, a partnership leader role today, you have to be highly cross-functional. So when I think about a couple of decades ago, if you're leading a channel or managing a channel, it was more like your role was reporting back. Of course, you had organizations supporting the partners and training the partners and etc. But it was very, very sort of a rear view approach. You reported back how things did last quarter, right? So you're kind of
Yes.
reporting back what rest of the organization did. And what I'm hearing from you now, you're driving the revenue through in a lot more opportunistic way, in a lot more, options are at hand, but it's a lot more complex, and you have to be forward looking because you have to make bets. And so talk to me a little bit about this. Why is this cross functionality is a lot more important today than it was maybe a decade or two ago?
Yeah, and I think the 20 years ago, as an example, it was a bit easier because if you had a swim lane where it was very large as a part of your business, for example, like Cisco and VMware are commonly known for routing, call it 80 to 90% of their business through the channel, then by nature, you get cross-functional alignment because so much of your business is going through partners. And so it becomes heavily resourced. And so alignment is organically going to happen that way. What happens is when you don't have that and you have these nuanced swim lanes and smaller percentages going through partners comparatively, right? You then have to make sure that you are in lockstep and have an operating cadence with these cross-functional teams and really understanding what their goals are and their strategy in getting there. And also making sure you're articulating what your partner strategy is and what your goals are and how your partner strategy is going to help them and their team get to their outcomes. And then understanding how you work together on the right initiatives that you're aligned on, where people are in agreement. These are the DRIs we're going to sign. These are the outcomes we agree we're going to go drive and track on this operating cadence. And then we're going to check in, whether it's weekly, monthly, or quarterly, on how we're doing on these initiatives, how we're tracking towards the outcomes. And we get to all hold each other accountable in terms of the resourcing and the progress and effort we're putting to getting to the finish line. That is one of the hardest muscles for partnerships people to build currently, because what can happen a lot of times in these fast growth companies is they operate in a silo and they get comfortable in running that business in a silo. But what would really amplify their impact is going to product, marketing, services, CS, sales, finance, ops, and being proactive in building those better together relationships as one team and starting to figure out what are the key things and initiatives they're working on where partners can augment and supercharge what they're doing together and ultimately get us to faster, better outcomes from a customer perspective, but also from a company perspective. And let me be very specific as an example. If you're, for example, if your company is struggling to get case studies, which you can then put into webinars, which then can lead to top of funnel, which then leads to pipeline and then revenue, right? One thing you could do right off the bat is have, for example, your CS team who might be collecting those case studies, work with a partner, find out who are their top customers where they can surface these case studies for you. And just by that alone, as an example, instead of your CS person reaching out to customers, trying to chase down a case study, spending a lot of time doing that, the partner might have a really close relationship because they're so close to it, right? They're doing the implementation, they're doing the advisory work. And maybe they could tee up that interest in a case study when one conversation, because they have a weekly cadence with that customer, and be able to bring that back and serve up that case study on a silver platter, right? Because you've given them the guidance. And now you can get to a formalized case study and a webinar, within 2 weeks, like very quickly, right? And not only that, the partner could even help you drive attendance to that. And so you might have doubled, tripled your top of funnel because you have involved the partner and they've taken on most of the heavy lifting for you to go find that case study and ultimately help you put together that content by presenting on it with you as well. That's just a great example of where if you start thinking holistically with your partners versus just as a silo, right, you get these amplification impacts that can be really massive to your company. And this requires that the company start thinking about partnerships as a one team effort where everyone is responsible versus it's just a siloed team that goes and runs it and they have to get to the outcomes by themselves. But what's so much better is if you start thinking about it as one team to really to get to that exponential return.
So then are we looking for different attributes in Chief Partner Officer today than we looked at Channel Chief? And I'm using two different titles, kind of the similar scope, but are we looking for different skill sets than today?
I would say the same skill sets apply. It's just that with these new fast growth companies that we're seeing, it requires that those skill sets be even more honed in on and that the mindset shifts more, I would say, to proactive and really rolling up your sleeves and working on these key areas that I mentioned. What I will also say is, in general, the shift also from a specific partner leader within a certain partner type, as an example, to a CPO role, is the CPO will really think about the entire customer journey, right? Versus one or a few sets or subsets within that, as an example, right? So let me give a very specific example. If you're the reseller partner team, you might be rolling into the sales organization, like typically under a CRO or VP of sales. And then you might be looking at that very specific set of phases around the sales motion, as an example, right? But for post-sales, it may not apply as much because if they don't offer services, they're not really heavily involved post-sales, right? And so you have that very narrow view of the customer journey. Whereas when you level up into a CPO, you have to really look at every step of that journey I mentioned earlier. And then you have to think about where do partners solve for those gaps that the customer is running into? And what are the business implications so that I understand where to go prioritize and resource accordingly? And that is the biggest mind shift when you go from a leadership role in partnerships within a certain domain or type of partner to a CPO role.
I want to simplify, maybe pick four attributes and let you allocate like 100 points 20 years ago versus now, right? So when I think about 20 years ago, a channel chief had a, even going to use the word Rolodex. They had a Rolodex. They knew a bunch of, key people at disties. They knew key, bunch of partners. When they switched jobs, they took their playbook. They called those disties, called those partners, took some of their key reps. They built their next team, right? So if you take those set of attributes, today what I'm hearing, you have to be highly data driven, you have to be system driven, you have to be cross-functional, you have to be forward thinking, you have to, we've been kind of seeing the rise of partner advisory council as a representation of voice of the customer, in a structured way. So you have to orchestrate those. Then you have to have a relationship with disties, which are fundamentally different from marketplace and maybe in conflict. So you almost like an UN role plus a GM plus like a multiple roles, right? So what I mean by from skill sets wise, list of attributes wise, are there more expectation from these roles today than we had 10 or 20 years ago?
Yes, I would definitely say yes to that. And it's not that these partner types didn't exist back then. They did, right? Like SIs have been around 20 years ago when I first started. So we're affiliates. And so we're, service partners like agencies and resellers and referral. So the partner type still existed. And the harder part, though, is again, because you have more nuance in the swim lanes and you have many different partner types potentially solving along the way for the customer journey, it requires that you have to be very thoughtful about understanding which of the partner types to go prioritize for your customer and your business. And because these needs are evolving very quickly on the customer side, and also every company is different, right? At the end of the day, from the platform perspective, you really have to make sure you approach it from a first principles thinking standpoint to do it correctly at the company. And so that's what's really critical today is being able to work through that ambiguity and use this approach to better understand who are the right partner types to go bet on, which ones do I need to go prioritize. And it does require a skill set that needs to be much more honed in around the aspects that I talked about. And so I would say it is definitely harder than it used to be 20 years ago. I agree with you. Like back then, as an example, like when I shifted from Cisco to VMware, I could bring a lot of my Rolodex and partners over, and it would have been relatively easy to continue working with many of the same partners who, because they had a data center practice with Cisco, could be brought over to VMware. And I think some of that still applies today. Like if you went from one SaaS B2B company that did something for a specific sector and you went to a new company that's in that same sector, there could be overlap. That Rolodex could be still valuable as well. But today, what's really important is to make sure that it always anchors back to that customer journey and the problems that you're solving for. And for that, because of all the changes that are happening, you've got to be really thoughtful in how you do that. You've also got to be really thoughtful about bringing people along cross-functionally because, again, you're not getting the resourcing by default. So you have to go win a lot of hearts and minds, right? And so, for example, back when I was at VMware, we got a lot of resourcing for our partnerships team, where really that wasn't a challenge. But at a lot of these new fast growth companies, I would actually have to go to these cross-functional teams, articulate the strategy, explain what we needed from them, and also to get alignment and agreement that these are things that they should also resource and prioritize because it was important to our customers and our company. And so that was a much more, intensive process that had to be a lot more proactive than previous companies 20 years ago, as an example.
Awesome. Well, Nelson, we've kind of come to an end today, but I'd love to have you back to talk a little bit about the future on AI. We didn't get a chance to double click on that, but thank you again for your time. I know we've been super busy, but it has been an amazing conversation. So thank you.
Awesome to help out. And thanks for having me on, Sugata. Appreciate it.